Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this edition of Full Spectrum Survival News. Today is Friday, the 4th day of January, the year 2019, and we'll be covering the events that are important here to the awake and aware community. Now let's begin. Acting quickly and erecting a full-service quarantine and isolation unit to the best of the hospital's abilities. In Sweden, a man is being treated behind barriers on suspicion of infection with Ebola hemorrhagic fever after visiting Burundi, the regional authorities said on Friday. The hospital's chief medical officer claims that a suspected case is a young man who had been in Burundi for around 3 weeks, and upon return was exhibiting the classic symptoms of Ebola hemorrhagic fever, including vomiting blood, broken blood vessels, and other issues that are related to the virus. Authorities said that the hospital in Nkopeng, where the patient was first admitted, had its emergency room completely shut down, and the staff who treated the patient were, quote, cared for. But the extent of how these potentially exposed and maybe infected caretakers were cared for is still unknown at this time. Upon suspicion and likely a worsening of symptoms that were beyond the hospital's ability to care for the patient, he was eventually transferred to an infection control clinic in Uppsala. We will wait to see if and when or how other cases of Ebola arise from this in the nosocomial setting. In other health news, we have been reporting for some time on the newest understanding of how the bacteria that is inside of the human gut affects everything from a person's susceptibility to depression and anxiety, all the way to their ability to fight off all manners of disease. Now researchers with Montana State University are showing that microbes in the human gut play an important role in protecting against acute toxicity, including exposure to arsenic, a problem that affects an estimated 200 million people who are exposed to it through contaminated drinking water around our world. Published in the journal Nature Communications, researchers found that microorganisms from a healthy human gut in our microbiome, which is often the byproduct of the ingestion of non-soluble fibers coupled with fermented foods, has a protective measure against toxic chemicals, exposure to them, before they become absorbed into the human body. Just another reason to begin self-fermenting and taking control of our bodies inside and out before a disaster strikes. Doublespeak and confusion still abounds on the topic of planet-wide patterns of warming and cooling, as the mainstream pushes an agenda that ends at the path of taxing you and I, the citizens of the planet, for our follow-through with a lifestyle that has been presented to us completely by the governments of a modern world. On the polar opposite of this doublespeak is ongoing research, like the data that we're covering today, by Harvard University with the Harvard John A. Paulson School of Engineering and Applied Sciences, in which researchers find that planet surface cooling is continuing to take place in the Pacific Ocean, even while terms like global warming continue to make the news. The research titled The Little Ice Age and 20th Century Deep Pacific Cooling is worth the read concerning patterns on our planet. In other news, media outlets and veiled citizens are making a large deal out of the Democratic majority in the U.S. House of Representatives, where they use terms like an end of Republican monopoly and taking control of the country. Seeing the forest beyond the trees, we see that this act is merely a cycle of behavior and activity that takes place time and time again throughout U.S. history, where its cyclical nature is part of a proven effort to control a populace by giving them a choice between two controlled supposed oppositions, allowing them to vent their frustration and to blame the shortcomings of a nation on the opposition. All the while, the fork in the road between the two opposing or supposed opposing parties ends at the same place of power. We expect to see minimal change in the overall pattern of U.S. governmental behavior, and will continue to see a move toward race wars and opposition implementation that removes the blame from corrupt organizations of power and moves it toward the people that would otherwise rise up against them and against that corruption. Moving on, only days after we discussed a common pattern of behavior between the election promises of the new Brazilian president and the push that led to the U.S. presidency of Donald Trump, through a crackdown on crime and a fixing of a broken economy, Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro made the announcement that Brazil is open to housing a U.S. military base on the country's soil, a move seen as a sharp shift in Brazilian policy. And finally, Thai authorities are closing ports, airports, making mandatory evacuations, and issuing emergency declarations ahead of a tropical storm, which is feared to be the worst storm to hit Thailand in nearly 30 years. Residents caught in the wake of this storm are being urged to gain higher ground and to shelter in place within a strong wooden or cement building. And finally, we had a few viewers ask yesterday about the links, including our newest Patreon member, Toby, who said, quote, "Your report on transglutaminase hits home. Could you please post a reference to the data source so that we can follow it here in the community?" He said he couldn't find it on Google or Bing. In addition to giving Toby the link, we post the links to each one of our stories to our Patreon page every single day. This is in addition to daily preparedness information and survival information as well. Membership there begins at $1 and you'll receive access to everything that's on the Patreon platform. The news only exists because of the answered call of our Patreon members. So for anyone watching who would like to support the outreach that we have here and to get the links, if the news brings you just 5 pennies of information or even entertainment, please consider joining our community there. This week's Full Spectrum Survival News is also brought to us in part by MRENation.com, our community's resource for meals that are ready to eat. Visit MRE Nation and use the coupon code FSS10, and you'll receive 10% off of your entire order. As always, from Kelly and I to you and yours, stay safe and keep watch.